Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second week. We're kind of halfway through the second week of the Low Carbon Design Institute's Summer Residency 2022. I'm extremely pleased to welcome Claire Rowland as a speaker today. Claire and I have been friends for a very long time. We've even worked together on several occasions, which has always been an absolute pleasure. And I'm so grateful that she would take the time to speak to us about what I consider to be, along with Chris Adams's talk yesterday, the most technical talks that we have alongside the program, I guess, even if, Claire, you might not think that this is a particularly technical topic. Considering all the other talks that we have, it sort of is. I'll do just a little bit about Claire. Claire is a product strategy and experience design consultant specializing in the Internet of Things, hardware-enabled services, and clean energy technology. She is currently working with the Energy Systems Catapult, scaling their Living Lab research testbed as part of the Whole Energy System Accelerator program. She is the lead author of Designing Connected Products, UX for the Consumer Internet of Things, that was published at O'Reilly. I really recommend. It's just such a Bible for anybody interested in user experiences and complex digital physical systems. I want to thank our sponsor today for this talk, which is Moixa. Moixa are a London-based company making smart battery hardware and grid share software to facilitate smart energy storage and sharing. So thankful to them to support this talk. Claire, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. And let me just share my screen, and hopefully when I go to, I may not be able to see you. So if there are questions, when I go into presenter mode, so if there are questions, just somebody might need to flag that to me. Can you all see, can you see the screen with the presenter notes or the screen with the slides?
We can see your slide full screen, all good.
Fantastic, okay, great. So I'm going to be talking today about consumer challenges in decarbonising energy. So this is to do with the changing energy system and consumers' relationship with it. I've tried not to make it too technical, but there is quite a lot of context about what's actually going on with the energy system and what the and some of that is a little bit technical. But I'm going to try and wrap this up by kind of identifying what some of the challenges might be for consumers in that model, because I think that seemed like the kind of the obvious innovation space. But we should have some time to chat at the end. I'm happy to answer any questions, happy to kind of take that in a different direction if you want. Alex has already introduced me, and two of you know me anyway, so I guess I can skip over this. But I think these days I focus on product management, experience design, and obviously I work across IoT. Some of you know me for that, but I've also spent quite a lot of the last few years working in clean energy technology. And these are some of the people that I've been doing both IoT and energy tech for in recent years. Everything from breast pumps to industrial power tools via smart metering, energy management, connected homes, supply chain, EV smart charging, and medical applications. So quite a range. I am currently working, as Alex said, with the Energy Systems Catapult, which is a not-for-profit innovation agency in the UK. Dedicated to decarbonising the energy system. On a programme, they have a Living Lab testbed of 1,100 UK homes, some of them in varying degrees of IoT enablement. We have a partnership with Power Networks Demonstration Centre at Strathclyde University. That whole thing together is called the Whole Energy Systems Accelerator. Don't worry about all the technical details in this, but basically what it means is we can simulate everything from future conditions on the power grid. What if it's 2030 and everyone in Dundee is charging their EV at the same time and there's no wind? All the way through to what that might mean in terms of the market. So would prices change? How do you balance supply and demand? To controlling devices in people's homes, turning things on and off, and sort of round again in a loop. So we can run these kind of what if scenarios, and that's aimed at innovators developing new energy products, services, and business models to be able to come in and test those things at a kind of near real world, kind of slightly future facing sort of kind of place. What I want to cover today is a little bit about sort of how people currently think about power, or rather the fact that actually they don't, or the way that they think about it is very simplistic and it's going to have to change. A little bit of stuff that I've tried not to make too technical about how the power system actually works and how that will be changing, as will need to change as we decarbonise it. How we need to balance supply and demand to make the best use of renewables. This is one of the biggest questions to decarbonising power. What that impact that has on consumers, and what opportunities that might create for consumer innovation, which would be great to talk about. I want to say I'm mostly going to be talking about electricity today. I'm conflating, not to conflate energy with electricity. Obviously, energy includes other things. I think certainly in the Netherlands, I'm not sure about Belgium, but certainly in the Netherlands, obviously there's quite a lot of gas used for heating as well. So gas is a big part of this. Decarbonising gas is partly about shifting things to electrification, but there are other systems, there are other solutions, things like introducing hydrogen into the gas grid, but they're all at the big system scale, and I figured that these were probably not going to be the kind of scope of things that people would be looking at in this programme. I'm also mostly going to be talking about consumers, as I said, that the principles are similar, particularly for small businesses. It's just needed to be cut down to a manageable size. But we can talk about businesses if you've got ideas there. And I apologise, I'm also mostly going to be talking about the UK. I didn't realise I was going to have quite such an international cohort, but also I think while there are lots of very common issues across all energy systems, so the big kind of big scale issues are the same, but there are some differences in how specific markets operate. So hopefully we haven't got too much of those differences there, and most of this will be applicable to you as well. So the first thing is that people basically just don't really think about power very much, except when they get a bill. I'm old enough to remember a few dim vignettes from the mid-late 1970s, and I just kind of love this picture because it sort of feels like how everyone thinks about the 1970s. And I didn't have cooling towers behind my house, but I do remember a lot of it felt very brown because everything seemed to be brown. But one of the memories that stuck with me is eating dinner cooked on a camping stove, cooked by candlelight, because we used to have rolling power cuts caused by industrial action from power workers and coal miners. And we generated most of the power in the UK from coal back then. So if there wasn't enough coal, then there wasn't enough electricity. So when I was 3 and at the time, and I thought it was all terribly exciting, but with hindsight, it's kind of like quite shocking, because now we, in those of us living in sort of in developed markets, our experience of electricity is it basically is just there. It's reliable. It's like power cuts are pretty uncommon. It's certainly for those of us in living in sort of reasonably densely populated areas. So we just kind of think about it as water. It's very low awareness. There's a constant, that supply is pretty constant. We don't think about the work that it takes to kind of get that into our homes, and most of us have very little kind of knowledge of what's going on behind the scenes to kind of balance out supply and demand. And it doesn't matter what time of day we use it. It costs us much the same. There are some exceptions to that. But that model relies very heavily on carbon emitting electricity generation, which we'll talk about in a minute. So for most people, their sort of primary relationship with energy at the moment is through a bill. This is the thing that they think about. So these are a couple of British examples. Good Energy, who sell renewable energy and carbon offset gas. And SSE, who are one of the kind of big conventional suppliers, and there's some kind of legal there's some standards that you have to comply with when you issue a bill, some common components, but there's a lot of standardization, but they all look slightly different. But this is the kind of thing that people get, and they look at that and they go, kilowatt hours, and they don't really know what that is, and so maybe they're not thinking about it terribly hard. But this is basically it. With the current energy crisis, I'm not sure exactly how things are in the Netherlands and Belgium, but certainly right now in the UK, energy prices have shot up massively. Right now, a lot more people are starting to fall into fuel poverty, starting to struggle with their bills. There's an estimate that we will have about 40% of the country in fuel poverty this winter. our definitions of fuel poverty vary across the different nations within the UK. But essentially, I think in England, this is about the proportion of your income that you spend. I'm working mostly with Scotland at the moment, but I think it's about the proportion of, was it Scotland? The proportion of income that's being spent on disposable income that's being spent on heating. The definitions have changed, but that one's kind of good enough. This is people who are struggling. This is people who are having to decide between food and heating in their homes. So this is a massive and growing and very acute problem. This is we're doing quite well in the UK, and I suspect probably also in other people who've got access to the North Sea. If you've flown over the North Sea recently, you'll have seen loads of wind farms. We are certainly in the UK generating a lot more clean power than we did. So one of the things that one of the sectors of the economy that we're doing really well at decarbonising is power generation. And that's the line. That's this. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's the line that you can see there. We're not doing particularly well at decarbonising lots of other things. So most of those carbon emission reductions across industry have come from the power sector in the last 10 years. But we still do depend on fossil fuels for energy generation. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And we still use a lot of fossil fuels for heating and transport, which I think are called out separately here. So buildings will include heating, and transport includes, I don't know if that's just personal, if that's also commercial transport. So to decarbonise those other things, some of them will need to be shifted more over to electrification. If you are burning gas for heating, then you're obviously generating carbon. If you're generating that heat from electricity, you might be burning carbon to generate that electricity, but you can also get that electricity from low carbon sources. So shifting things over to electrification is a really big driver here. But to rely more on electricity generated from renewables, we're going to need a more dynamic system. Something that's more, some of that is about, I'll talk about this in a minute, but some of that's about infrastructure, some of that's about making that infrastructure smarter, more responsive. Some of that's about factors in the wholesale market, so behind the scenes, how are people paying for things, how's it being priced? And some of it is about making consumers more aware of what's going on, either getting them to shift their behaviours or using automation to do that for them, maybe paying for things in different ways. So the question here, I think really interesting question from a consumer perspective is, given that people don't really think about this stuff at the moment, except in terms of how painful it is to pay for it, how are we going to get them to have a more engaged relationship with energy, and what's the appropriate point in that? How much work do we do on their behalf, and how much do we expect them to do? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the power system works and try and keep this kind of not too hefty. This is what electricity demand looks like over the course of a day in the UK. And you can see that there's this kind of, overnight, so I'm sure it's very, very similar in other markets. There's much lower demand overnight. Then there's a bit of a spike in the morning when people get up and start kind of cooking breakfast, boiling kettles, kind of needing hot water. Then it drops off a little bit in the middle of the day, but probably not as much as it used to. Now more people are working from home. And then there's a massive spike in the evening, which is when people are at home cooking dinner, kind of using, perhaps using heating and all of that kind of stuff. So there's this pattern of a smaller morning peak and a large evening peak is kind of still the case even now. It's got a little bit kind of smoother perhaps in the last couple of years. But this evening peak gets even bigger in winter, because when it's dark, people are using more heating, more lighting. So one of the big challenges in terms of for the network operators who run the grids is figuring out how you can supply that peak in demand. In terms of how we generate it, this is UK specific, but what may be the same in your countries. The biggest source, although we've made some progress in decarbonising it, the biggest source of power still is gas. So we've shifted away from using coal. Burning gas to generate electricity generates less carbon than coal, but it still generates carbon. It's not great. We need to shift away from this. In April, UK generated nearly half of its electricity from zero carbon sources. That means wind. We've got loads and loads of offshore wind. It also means nuclear. which people sort of, many people have mixed feelings about, but nuclear power generation doesn't generate carbon. So there's an argument that that's part of the mix that we're going to need going forward. There's some solar, there's a tiny bit of hydro, and then we use some other things that generate carbon, and then we import 5% of our 5% of our energy from other countries. Some of that will be zero carbon, some of that particularly will be French nuclear, but we don't count that as zero carbon. In terms of how it gets to our homes, worth understanding a little bit about this. So first of all, it gets generated, then the voltage gets kind of pumped up to the max, and it goes over a high voltage network. These are the big pylons and things that you see. That's for kind of getting it around the country, kind of doing and then it gets stepped down, and then we have what we call distribution grids, which is the thing that's probably worth knowing the most about from a flexibility perspective. And these are separate in the UK, separate businesses who are responsible for getting that electricity down from the big pylons into homes, and so they have the job of figuring out whether they might have the job of approving, for example, if you want to install an EV charger in your home, you have to note in the UK, you have to notify them, or heat pump, or if you go over a certain level of, if you install lots of things and suddenly your electricity demand is likely to go over certain thresholds, you may have to notify them, because they need to know that the pattern of demand in that home is going to change, and they might need to come and upgrade the supply to your house. So these people are thinking very hard about decarbonisation and changing patterns of consumption as electricity consumption rises. In terms of how we buy it, well, obviously the people who generate it will then sell it on the wholesale markets. That will be, this is a little bit simplified, but basically that then gets bought by the suppliers who you buy your energy, consumers buy their energy from. They sell that on to consumers. So the consumer's relationship is with whoever their energy provider is, but there's a whole wholesale market behind that. And various kind of supply and demand economics and different services. And then there are also people providing services into, there's some other actors in here who provide various types of services for helping to balance out the grids, but that's I didn't want to overcomplicate this. In terms of how it's priced, the price that you pay as a consumer is only some of that comes from the cost of the supplier buying your energy. So there's some other stuff that needs to get factored into that as well. So in the UK, typically there's that might be about 35. It will cost your supplier what your supplier charges you. It will be about a third or so of that will be the actual cost that they've spent on the wholesale markets to buy that energy. Then they have to pay network charges to the various network operators for access to the networks to supply that to your home. And then there's some stuff like the cost of customer service, and then there are some government schemes that support things like renewable generations and renewable generation, people in fuel poverty. And then there's some other stuff on top of that. So there are all these kind of various factors going on that affect the price of energy. So in terms of how that's changing as we need to decarbonise it, well, as I mentioned, we're going to be adding more electric loads to the system. Things like switching gas heating over to heat pumps, things like EVs, and also adding in, aside from adding in kind of additional kind of small scale generation. So if you get solar panels at home, that changes the mix as well. But basically, one of the key things that's going to happen is that there's going to demand will rise as more things shift over to electricity. Various scenarios for what that might look like. National Grid in the UK have done some projections, and they vary from a 50% increase in peak demand to 100% increase in peak demand, sort of in the next 15 years or so. So that's going to be the challenge. There is that not just that we're using more overall, but also that those peaks, so the evening peaks, which are the really, really hard part to meet, are getting bigger. So it's a challenge. And the problem with renewables is that the times when they're generating, when there's wind, when there's sun, don't necessarily match up with the times that people want energy. So this diagram here is a little bit technical, but basically what you can see is that this blue line here represents demand over a kind of 24-hour period. So it goes up and down like the line we saw earlier. And at times there's much more demand than there is supply. So this might be when it's dark and there's no solar, or there's no wind. So then there's unmet demand that has to be met by some other means. You can't generate that electricity exactly at the time that people want to use it. And then there are other times when there's loads of demand, but people don't actually want to use it. So then you get what's called sort of curtailment situation, which might mean that we have to switch wind turbines off. Or and that's kind of a waste really, because it's like, well, we've got power we could be generating, it just doesn't have anywhere to go. So it's a bit of a challenge, and if you don't keep these things in balance, then you start to develop problems on the grid basically. So you can't shove it all in, and kind of you mostly have to use it at the time that it's being generated. The other challenge that we've got is that this is probably true across lots of markets. It's certainly very much true in the US. Is a lot of the infrastructure we have was not really planned around all of this additional demand from electrifying transport and heating. Some of it might have been based around assumptions from the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s about just how much electricity a home would actually need. And so it certainly didn't plan for things like, they weren't planning for things like EV hubs, they weren't planning for things like renewable generation feeding in. They weren't planning for, people's home fuses need upgrading, substations need upgrading, the lines need upgrading. So there's quite a complicated picture now. This is just one example from one of the network distribution network operators in the UK. Over the next 2 years, they're spending £60 million on upgrading the electricity network just to support connections for new customers and green projects. So this is huge, but the cost of upgrading that, in what we can't do is just because it's too expensive, is just upgrade all of the infrastructure overnight to support all of the additional demand. So there are going to have to be some other clever things that we do to try to kind of balance out supply and demand. I think it's worth saying that having a reliable supply isn't necessarily everybody's experience of energy around the world. So I'm talking mostly about the UK here, but there are some real problems with power grids elsewhere in the UK. You may have heard about what happened in Texas, which a couple of years ago, which kind of operates as a semi-independent grid for sort of political reasons. I know the energy prices were kind of up and down and all over the place, and lots of there was a bit of carnage basically. But this is what's another pattern. I was interviewing people for heating flexibility projects a while ago. And I spoke to a woman who had family in Pakistan, and a lot of consumers were sort of having trouble getting their heads around the idea that things might be balancing the grid. And this woman said, "Oh yeah, we have that in Pakistan. It's load shedding, and all the lights go out, and everyone just goes like, oh yeah, load shedding." But she was quite sort of blasé about it. But it's a very, very serious situation. If you don't, in Pakistan and India, are not generating enough, for various reasons, not able to generate enough power to meet air conditioning demand. And there have been some very extreme heat waves there recently, and there are parts of the country which are without power for 16 hours a day. And this is kind of in 50-degree heat. That's a life or death situation for some people. So this is how badly it can go wrong if we don't manage to keep all of those things in balance. So I want to talk a little bit about balancing out supply and demand, because that's one of these key things here. Renewables are intermittent. There isn't renewable power always when you want it. And if you don't have the same amount of power going into the grid as the same amount of power that's being drawn out of it, then the things get out of balance basically. There's a frequency that I don't fully understand this, but there's a frequency that the grids have to operate at, and if you go outside that, bits of it start going offline. So the first thing that we can do with that is storage. And that can be things like, we don't have very much of this at the grid at any scale at the moment, but that can be things like putting big batteries into bits of the grid so that we can store renewable power when it's available and then draw on it later. It can be on a small scale. This could be, so that might be things like, you may have heard of vehicle to grid, which is using electric vehicles as basically batteries on wheels. This is kind of emerging at the moment, but we are starting to see kind of small scale commercial solutions. This is one from Octopus Octopus Energy in the UK. So basically, you leave your EV plugged in all the time, or as much of the time as you're at home. When there is power in the grid that needs to go somewhere, the car can draw that down. When there is more demand than the grid needs, the grid needs to draw on additional sources, then you can share some of that power some of that energy from your battery back with the grid. And then I'm glad you mentioned Moixa earlier, Alex, because I've got a Moixa battery in here, so it was good I didn't pick somebody else's battery. But they're also sort of small scale home batteries. These are sort of commonly used by people who've got solar generation at home. To store some of that, to store additional power so that they can use it later on. It's pretty early days for all of this stuff. We don't have enough of it at this moment, and it's going to take a long time to scale up. But this is if you have enough of these kind of small scale things, it becomes part of the solution. I've realised that I don't know whether I can share sound with you. Let's see how this goes. We didn't check this out beforehand. Can you hear that?
No. I wonder if there's an original sound thing that I could be doing on my side. So let me, maybe original
check
sound
computer
on
sound.
your side. Oh, there we go.
I think I have to do some password due to. I have to install the Zoom audio device. That's going to take too long. Yeah. Okay. Let's not do that. I think there's some annoying music on it, and there's basically, I think, captions. So I'm going to play this anyway. Let's see if you can see this.
We can definitely see it.
Okay, I'm going to switch back from that, but hopefully hopefully you're able to follow that, and I give you a little bit of context about what with this demand side response issue. So this is about what we used to do was plan for, and still will need to do, is plan for times where there's likely to be a very high demand on the grid, and then spin up generation in order to meet that demand. And what we're going to have to do going forwards is also think about how we can manage and sort of spread out that demand to as well, rather than having these huge peaks, to be able to make better use of renewables. So it's hopefully that was possible to follow. And so how do we do that? Well, there are things that some of that will need to happen through consumer behaviour change. This is a shot here of the screenshot of the National Grid have an app called When to Plug In, which gives you advice about sort of what times of day energy is going to be, is going to be sort of most lowest, will have the lowest carbon intensity. So that's the times of day when more of the energy in the system will have been generated from renewables. So this is saying it's like, well, between 1:30, this is probably a sunny day, between 1:30 and 3:30 is a good time to run the dishwasher, kind of put the tumble dryer on if you have some control over when you can do that. The other thing is using automation. So this is EV Energy smart charging app. So electric vehicle smart charging will automate the process of figuring out when to turn the charger on and off. So rather than coming home at sort of 6 p.m. and plugging your car in, as many people do, and having all of that charging delivered sort of from 6 o'clock into the early evening, and making that evening peak even worse. What this will do is spread that out over the course of overnight, for example. So if you are, you can say, well, I need to leave the house at 7 in the morning. I want to have a certain amount of charge in my battery by that time, but I don't really care when that's delivered. I don't really care that it hasn't all happened at 6 o'clock. It could happen at 4 a.m. and that would be fine. So another lever that we have, there's various levers that we have within pricing. So people will kind of shift. Some people will shift their demand around through the goodness of their hearts because they want to do the right thing for the grid. But by and large, to get large numbers of people to do that, it requires some sort of price incentive. And one of those could be just giving people a rebate for switching some things off. This is a service called Equiwatt. I've done some work with them with the Catapult on a couple of occasions, and they provide a platform for people to participate in what they call equi-events or flexibility events, where they'll notify you and say, we need you to turn some things off now. Some of those will be direct loads that are connected, so things that they can automate switching off for you. Some of them might be things that you do manually. Another lever is pricing lever is time of use tariffs. This is Octopus Go. If you opt into this, you pay a different price for energy between midnight, 4:30 midnight, and 4:30 in the morning. So it's massively cheaper overnight, which is an incentive to shift things like electric vehicle charging to those time periods. And then there are dynamic tariffs. This is Octopus Agile, and these are energy tariffs where the price of energy varies quite dramatically, and you'll be notified a day ahead as to what energy prices will look like the next day, and they will vary by the half hour. So at some points it might be very expensive, typically around the peak. At some points the pricing, you might even get paid to take electricity from the grid because there's lots of renewable generation and it's got to go somewhere. So this is interesting, but I think we'll talk in a minute about some of the challenges that this creates for people. And I mentioned nuclear earlier. All of these things that we're doing will probably still not be enough to get us over to 100% renewables in the short term. So there are other things that we're going to need to do, and there are aside from storage, aside from flexibility, we're still going to need some backup generation that we can spin up, and that might be nuclear, or it might be some other things. So I want to talk a bit about the impact on consumers, and start by talking about the things that tend to underpin people's decisions that they make around energy. There's sort of broadly, there are four of them. So there's how much it costs, how the fact that they want to be comfortable. People don't like being cold. They don't like having cold showers. They want to be able to cook their dinner. There's the convenience of being able to do things when you want to do them or when you need to do them, of not having to think too hard about making decisions, or whether to switch supplier, those kinds of things. If you're overstretched in other areas of your life, then you will prioritize convenience. And then there are environmental concerns, and all of these things. Typically, you see that people have got some combination of these, and they might kind of be weaker or stronger exert a weaker or stronger pull at different times. And then I think one thing I've learned, which is pretty obvious really, is that the best mass market, in order to energy is very, very mass market. We all need it. Any solution, you can develop solutions that work for a small number of people, but ultimately we're going to have solutions that work for all the different groups across society. And so it is literally everybody. And the best mass market service experiences don't assume that people have lots of knowledge or time. It's perfectly viable to develop something for the geeks, but the geeks alone are not going to get us to where we need to be. So the best things kind of smooth out the complexity. They don't give people decision fatigue, and nobody really, lots of people don't really want to think about energy too hard. But actually, I think we're probably heading the other way for a while, because we're going to have, in order for everyone not to have to think about it, we have to have a lot more, we have to invest quite a lot in infrastructure. So we're probably heading to a situation where people are going to have to engage more with energy. And the problem is that right now, most of them don't really understand it. Many people don't know what a kilowatt hour is. This changes when they get an EV very often, and they've got a dashboard that's telling them how many miles they're doing to a kilowatt hour. But the starting point is not there. And they have no model of what's going on behind the scenes. They think if they're buying green energy from a green energy supplier, they don't understand that using electricity at 7 o'clock in the evening, if they're doing that they're probably not getting nice green electrons that were harvested by the wind pixies. You probably are getting gas generated power at that time, whatever you're paying, whatever your contract with your supplier. And then the other thing about a lot of the levers that we're talking about at the moment are to do with variable pricing, so charging people more at times of day when there's higher demand, when there's more high carbon generation in the system. And on the one hand, you've got people, you've got the kind of free market people saying, well, it makes no sense to pay wind turbines to turn off. We need to create incentives for people to buy power when it's cheap. And I don't disagree with that. But at the same time, penalising people who don't have very much money for cooking their kids dinner at 6 o'clock in the evening, which is a thing that they can't choose to do at 2 a.m. instead, isn't fair. So how do you square that kind of, the relatively wealthy person with the EV and the heat pump who can do these things with, the kind of struggling, a very large number of struggling people who just don't have that much control. So I think this is a really interesting tension that's emerging in the system. The other thing to say is that all of this sort of flexibility and kind of automation and things, whether it's things like smart charging, which is fine, means handing over a certain amount of control. Some of you have done a lot of IoT. You know about the challenges of automation and kind of getting things, people setting things up that then behave in a way that turns out whether that end result is really what they wanted or not. There's quite a lot of evidence now from various trials that most people with EVs are happy with smart charging as long as they get the charge in the car in the morning that they want. But there are sort of mixed responses coming from heating and cooling flexibility. There was an example in the States that where it was probably just badly designed, but in Texas, that it was a power plan that allowed your network operator to have some control over your thermostat. And what was happening was that it was kind of massively raising the temperature, where people would expect, on a hot day when lots of people were trying to use cooling, it was massively raising the temperature and making people very uncomfortable. So So the dynamics of how you do this, that was badly executed. That's not, the point is not to say you shouldn't do this with heating and cooling, but the dynamics of how you do that with heating and cooling would need to be quite different, because we're making people uncomfortable doesn't sit very well with them. And then, and I've sort of touched on this a little bit, but fairness to everybody is really important. So a lot of the solutions we have at the moment really, could result in us charging more to people who are less able to pay, or penalising people for essential everyday tasks. So we all need heat and power. Most of all, the vulnerable people who may have health conditions that mean that it's really important that they don't get cold. So how do we maintain that as an essential service? How do we keep it affordable for people who, not just for the people who can afford all of the low carbon technologies and energy efficiency measures, but everybody else? And how do we maintain access to? How do we ensure access to innovations? So people who rent can't always install equipment in their homes. Some people are digitally excluded, don't have or can't get internet access, and there's just the sheer complexity of some of this. So accessing the right advice, accessing the right funding, just finding somebody reliable to install things in your home can be really difficult, even for people who have the time and knowledge to do that. So I tried to think about what some of these opportunities for consumer innovation might be, and to kind of seed that with you. I think it looks, I've got some examples here that just to show. I think some of those questions are things like, how might we shift demand as much as possible to times when clean energy is available? It might be, how might we make clean energy and low carbon technologies affordable and available to everybody? It might be about delivering better outcomes. So a lot of people don't necessarily have effective heating or have poorly insulated homes, so they often struggle to they're paying a lot for energy, but they're also not getting a good result from that. So that's a factor as well. How can we make reducing carbon from energy use as simple as possible for people who are not used to having to think about energy? And how can we make it fair? So that might be about pricing. So pricing in ways that don't penalise people for essential everyday needs, but do provide incentives to when some consumption is discretionary, they do give you an incentive to shift that to a greener pattern of use. So I just want to give you a few examples. I've talked a little bit about Octopus already. Octopus are one of the probably the most innovative UK energy supplier at the moment. They are trying to make heat pumps more accessible. They have a goal of trying to deliver a heat pump installation for the same price as replacing a gas boiler. And so they're investing very heavily in R&D, in building a supply chain of installers, R&D into technology itself, to try to develop that. This is a US example. This is Block Power. They provide low carbon heating, cooling, and hot water to building owners, often in low income areas, for no upfront costs. So if you own an apartment block, which you're probably renting to people on low incomes, they can come in and install all of this stuff, and it's essentially you lease the equipment from them. Then there is providing easier access to energy efficiency advice. I'm working quite a bit with Scotland at the moment, and Scotland are ahead of the tend to do this stuff better than the rest of the UK. And so they have this network called Home Energy Scotland, which is funded by the government, and these are local kind of grassroots organisations who provide energy efficiency advice, who help people access grants and funding for home improvements to make their homes more energy efficient. So if you live in Scotland, there's a clear kind of starting point for a pathway to what do I do? It doesn't require very much knowledge to kind of access them and to get started with that process. If you live in England, good luck to you. Then there is the local energy, community and local energy, and this is a pretty interesting one. So there's sort of increasingly kind of pockets of local and community owned generation. So that might be solar panels on the roof of a school, It might be a small kind of solar farm that's work a community's kind of, or a village hall, where the community has actually chipped in to buy that resource. You can sell that power back to the grid, or you can also develop schemes to provide that energy to the local community. So in some way, so we're heading to a scenario where you might be able to buy some of your energy from your local school, and they would get, so you might pay a lower price for it, you might not, but even if you don't, the school's getting some of that money. So there are this kind of grassroots type stuff is pretty interesting. Again, this is another Scottish example. So there's a scheme, Local Energy Scotland, which provides funding and easy starting points for community groups to get started with doing this stuff. Another one is the idea of de-risking, taking the risk for people out of switching to low carbon technology. So I'm going to buy a heat pump that's really expensive. What if it doesn't work? This is an example of a project that was sort of initiated by the Energy Systems Catapult, where I work at the moment, a few years ago. So this is shifting from selling people kilowatt hours to framing the benefits they get from energy as a service. So instead of paying a supplier for a certain number of kilowatt hours, the idea was that you would pay them for a heat outcome. So they would take on operating the heating equipment in your home, figure out how much energy it's going to take to keep you comfortable, ask you what you thought was comfortable, and then generate a price for that. So you could pay for a certain number of warm hours. I want my living room at 21 degrees. I want the bedroom at 18 degrees. And you'd have that kind of control. So this is sort of, there was a trial a couple of years ago. We're doing some more work around this at the moment. But what it allows is for it to sort of, you could again get a heat pump for no upfront cost, but you're paying for that along with the energy you use for heating under a different model. And then the final one I wanted to share, and this is another Energy Systems Catapult example. This was a service that's targeted at some of the most vulnerable people. It's a trial that's been run. It's called Warmth on Prescription. And this is the idea that the NHS it costs the NHS quite a lot of money. I forget what the numbers are, it might be on here. So the NHS spends $1 billion every year treating illnesses that have been caused or made worse by cold homes. And obviously, people living with long-term health conditions very often are amongst the poorest. So some of the people I work with sort of flipped this around and said, well, what if instead of the NHS paying to deal with the health consequences of people who are living in cold homes, what if we just paid them? What if we just paid for their heating instead? Wouldn't that be better? So we've been running some small scale local trials where somebody has a health condition with particular kind of general practice doctor surgeries. Someone who has a health condition can go to their GP, which is made worse by heating, can go to their GP, and the GP can offer them essentially a prescription for a certain amount of heating, so that they don't have to worry about their heating costs, and they get better health outcomes. So I think this is I love this example. So that was the last one I had. I've dumped some kind of links for further reading about energy on the last slide, but I wanted to ask what you thought, and what's kind of stood out from this, and if you have any thoughts on what the opportunities might be, or what might be interesting to you.